first time I realized my name had been quietly peeled off my own front door, strangers were walking through my living room in their socked feet, murmuring about natural light and whether the fireplace was original. It was a Sunday open house, complete with a bowl of mints on the entry table, candles that smelled like someone had baked an apology, and a young agent greeting visitors with that bright, professional smile people learn for funerals and hard sales. The sign out on the sidewalk showed my address in tall letters, and underneath it said, in a tidy font that had seen committee approvals, vacant. Owner relocated to memory care. When I told the agent that I was the owner and I had made myself oatmeal in my own kitchen that morning, she held her smile as if it were a fragile object someone had paid for, glanced at my hands, and said she would get her team lead. I stood at the edge of the living room rug and watched a couple in their 30s open the hall closet where my late husband's winter coat still hung, cedar blocks tucked into sleeves the way he had always done it, saying moths respected order as much as they feared smells. The couple had removed their shoes because a sign requested it. Their socks left faint prints on the polished floor I oil-waxed every spring, a habit left over from my mother's rules. And the woman asked whether the attic had storage because her husband collected guitars. I said, out loud, that it did, and the woman thanked me politely the way you thank docents in museums. Then she looked past me to a printed sheet on the sideboard, property package. It said, where there was an MLS printout, a disclosure summary, and a flyer noting estate sale items negotiable. I read that line twice, because the dining table in the picture, the one negotiable, was the same one where I had graded my students' math tests for 32 years and where, the night before, I had curled my hair with a foam roller so I could look decent for church. When the team lead arrived, red blazer, clipboard, brisk steps, she addressed me the way medical staff sometimes talk to women with gray hair and a purse full of loyalty cards. She asked my name, and when I told her, she said my son, Daniel, had signed the listing agreement on my behalf. She mentioned a durable power of attorney, notarized the previous week, and assured me everything had been checked with the family. She said it softly, the same way people say, with your doctor, as if medicine had been practiced and a diagnosis reached. I asked to see the paper she was referring to. She said she didn't keep originals on site. I told her she didn't need originals to show me what had been written about my life. Now, before you decide what kind of woman I am, let me tell you what I was doing the morning this little theater set scattered into my life. I was mending the pocket of Daniel's son's hoodie because he had torn it climbing the fence behind the school and because when he asked if it could be fixed, I told him yes, without thinking of another thing. I was a school bursar until I retired, which is to say I understand how small numbers add up to big mistakes and how one missing receipt doesn't mean missing money, but sometimes means something worse. I cooked every other Thursday for the church's soup night, and I kept a small tin in the kitchen drawer where I put the little screws I found when chairs loosened and cupboard handles lost their bite. I talk too much to the grocer because at that store the clerks change every 2 months, and I like to greet people long enough to see how their lives turn out. You asked for honesty, and my honesty is this. For years after my husband died, I made such a project of not being a problem that I became invisible to the exact people I thought I was saving effort for. If you had asked Daniel to list the things I do, he would have looked genuinely puzzled, not because he is cruel, but because the rice cooker cleaned itself, and the birthday cards addressed themselves, and mosquitoes learned my grandkids' names and avoided them out of respect. My daughter-in-law, Kelsey, is the kind of competent that makes phones unnecessary because she remembers everything, but she sees the world in problem-solution shapes, and the older I got, the more she saw my edges as something to sand. The team lead finally handed me the packet and excused herself to tell her staff to keep the upstairs closed because, she explained, we don't want to confuse the guests. That would have been funny if my heart hadn't been making a fist. The MLS printout had a list price circled and beneath it a note, seller prefers quick close. On the third page, under special remarks, someone had typed, seller to remove personal items. Property will be delivered vacant. Estate owned, representative has full authority. They used estate the way people use they when they want to move a story along without naming characters. I traced the line about authority as if the ink would smear and tell me it was a mistake. It didn't smear. I found a quiet corner behind the piano and dialed Daniel. He didn't pick up at first. When he called back, I could hear road noise and Kelsey's voice in the background as if they were running errands, as if this would be one more minor call to slot between the pharmacy and a hardware store. I told him there were strangers in my dining room. I said the sign outside said I had been relocated. He didn't raise his voice. He said, "Mom, you scared us last month when you left the kettle on." I reminded him I had taken it off the heat. He said, "Still." He told me they had talked to the notary Kelsey's brother recommended, that it was just for ease, that no one was trying to make me feel pushed. He used the word ease the way people use comfort, as if you can rearrange a person's home around it. He told me they had scheduled a plumber to fix the upstairs toilet, which was kind because the toilet did sometimes sneeze when flushed. I asked him where I was supposed to sleep while my bed was being called negotiable. He said we would figure something out, and in that phrase I heard an adult son trying to help his mother, and I heard a man who had already decided where to place his mother's evening chair. I would like to tell you I snapped. I didn't. My voice stayed in that long register women learn from answering phones. I told him that if he wanted to talk about me leaving, we would talk, but that I would never be introduced to my own neighbors as an absent party. For a moment there was just the road noise and Kelsey saying something about picking up copies. Then Daniel said, "We'll come by tonight," and hung up, and I stood in my own living room with the printed packet's edges pressing into my palm, feeling not furious, but profoundly uninvited. The agent's assistant, small ponytail, nervous hands, came over and offered me a water bottle. She did that thing where she leaned in as if you might confide if someone gave you a part of their patience. She said, "I grew up in a town where everyone knew whose Tupperware was in whose freezer." It came out awkward and human, which to me is the most credible way anyone can speak. She lowered her voice and told me the signature on the listing agreement had looked a little off to her, like someone had tried to write with their non-dominant hand to match a sample. She said she wasn't an expert and didn't want trouble, but she'd seen a lot of signatures from elderly sellers, and this one had a different loop in the R of my last name. She said it and glanced over her shoulder. I asked her if she knew the notary who had stamped the power of attorney. She hesitated and then said it was a mobile notary, Tyler, who worked mostly for lenders. She added that Kelsey had been the one to confirm the appointment, that the notary had scanned the documents later from a printer that left a small streak at the edge. I asked her how she knew about the streak. She said the streak appears only on copies from that scanner, and her cousin, who works at a title company, calls it a fingerprint. I grew up with ledgers, with columns that need balancing and details that fall out of pockets, and I know the thing about fingerprints is that they are not interesting until they are matched to a hand. I thanked the assistant and asked for the notary's last name. She said she was not sure she should give it. I said she didn't have to give me anything except the exact spelling of Tyler's name as it appeared on the notary stamp. She raised her eyebrows at my wording, the way a person with decent training recognizes a person with a different kind of training, and she said it was Tyler Coates. She spelled it twice. She said she would be written up if she were caught sharing client details. I said I understood what it means to have a supervisor who looks for reasons. I told her she had given me nothing except a bottle of water. When the last couple had left and the candles had become ridiculous, the team lead came to tell me they would lock up at 5 and return the next weekend. I said there would be no next weekend, and she said she had a contract. I asked to see where in the contract my name appeared. She produced a digital tablet and showed me a PDF where my name had been typed and an electronic signature, not mine, sat with the confidence of a forged painting that had already been hung. The notary seal was a flattened circle and, yes, there it was, a faint streak on the lower left, like a scratch on glass. I took out my phone and photographed it. She said photography wasn't allowed for private agreements. I said my dining table had been photographed without asking, and if she wanted me to leave, she could call the police and tell them the homeowner was trespassing. Neighbors, of course, had noticed. The woman from across the street, whose husband trims his hedges with the zeal of someone who believes straight lines hold the world together, stopped by with cookies as if there had been a death, and I suppose there had been, just not the one people expected. She asked if I was settling in okay, and when I told her I hadn't relocated anywhere, Her eyebrows jumped the way sparrows do when they find a seed unexpected. She told me she had seen a man taking pictures of my mailbox a few days ago. She said he drove a white SUV with the name of a mortgage company on the side. She thought it was odd, but she had been on her way to her sister's, and she had only mentioned it now because it felt connected. I thanked her and took the cookies to the kitchen, where I noticed the little tin in the drawer had been moved 4 inches to the left. That tin is my barometer, my proof something small but essential has been shifted. I set it back and, when no one was looking, I took a picture of the inside of the drawer like it was a crime scene. Daniel and Kelsey arrived after dinner, their faces arranged for diplomacy. Kelsey had a folder, and Daniel had the smile he uses when his clients are upset about deadlines. They sat at the table and Kelsey slid the folder toward me. Inside was a printed durable power of attorney with my name, a beneficiary designation change form for my savings account at the credit union, and a letter from a senior living facility that says, in welcoming language, that my furniture would be moved for me. I saw a copy of a check, too, written to Coates Notary Services from Daniel's account, with the memo line, Mom POA. Kelsey explained, her voice even, that this was to make things simpler and to start the transition while we could do it at our pace. She said the word we, and I felt an odd, specific anger, not the kind that makes people throw things, but the kind that makes them fold napkins precisely. Daniel told me he didn't want me to worry, that the sale would give me cash to cover everything I might want, that this was about safety. He mentioned a kettle again. He said, very softly, Mom, I can't always be here. I don't like to make scenes, but I know how to ask questions. I asked who had witnessed my signature on the power of attorney. Kelsey said Tyler and a neighbor had been present. I asked which neighbor, and Kelsey said Mrs. Holt, as if producing the name of a teacher would smooth the page. Mrs. Holt is 89 and has macular degeneration. She signs her own name as if each letter is a hill, and she's too polite to turn back. I asked whether the bank had accepted the beneficiary form. Kelsey said it was submitted online. I asked when we had scheduled the moving truck. Kelsey said we were thinking next month. Daniel reached for my hand and told me he loved me, and I believe he does, but love is a doorbell that people press expecting the same house to open every time, not understanding that locks are changed after break-ins. I told them I wouldn't sign anything else that week, and I wouldn't leave my house, and I wouldn't be discussed as if I were across town. Kelsey said we could do this the easy way or the hard way. She said it without drama, as if choosing a route on a map. I told her that since she liked routes, we would take one that involves an attorney. Daniel's mouth tightened in the way that means he thinks I'm being stubborn to prove a point. He said he didn't want to argue. I said I didn't either, so we wouldn't. I stood up and, because I am still my mother's daughter, I offered them both tea. That night the house felt like a hand I couldn't unclench. I took out a folder I keep at the back of the linen closet, the one with my husband's insurance policy copies, our original deed, the will we had updated after he got sick, and the little sticky note he left himself about calling the credit union to ask about TOD designations. TOD stands for transfer on death. If you designate a beneficiary that way, the account bypasses probate and goes directly where you say it should go. We never finished setting those up because he went in for what we thought would be a short hospital visit, and then he didn't come home. Grief is a poor administrator. I ran my finger over his handwriting until I felt less like a woman whose house had been mislabeled and more like a person with a pencil. In the morning, I went to my credit union and asked to speak to whoever handled fraud alerts. I wasn't accusing anyone yet, but I wanted to learn the rules of the game other people had begun on my coffee table. The young man behind the glass stopped twirling his pen when I set the folder down. He asked for my ID twice, because policies are doors you need 2 keys for. He looked up the beneficiary change request and told me there had been an attempt submitted digitally, but because I had set up a requirement for in-branch confirmation only years ago, something I had almost forgotten, the request had been flagged and parked. He asked me whether I had requested a new online banking password reset the previous Thursday. I said I hadn't, and I watched his face, which was trained to be neutral, show real worry for a second. He asked me whether my son had access to my email. I told him I didn't think so. He printed a list of recent logins and slid it to me upside down the way nurses do with test results they can't interpret. I turned the paper around. There was an IP address I didn't recognize and a location listed as shared corporate network. He said that could be anything from a co-working space to a mortgage office. For the first time since Sunday, I felt the kind of relief that comes from proof, even weak proof, because even a blurred outline tells you where the edges are. Back home, the bowl of mints was still on the entry table like a joke that had outlived its context. I decided to leave it there as a reminder. I called the county recorder's office and asked how to pull the most recent documents recorded against my property. The woman on the phone, whose voice carried the careful clarity of someone who has worked in the same office through 7 software transitions, told me I could search online by parcel number. I did, and I saw a lien filed by a contractor I had never heard of, claiming unpaid work on an upstairs bathroom. The lien amount matched the estimate Daniel had mentioned for a repair we hadn't scheduled. The contractor's address was the same building as the mortgage company on my neighbor's SUV. The notary on the lien document was Tyler Coates. I don't scare easy, but I respect warning signs. A fake lien is a foothold for more. It says this house is not clean. It says people will look at your property and see work in progress, not home. I printed the lien and put it behind the first tab in a fresh binder. Then I did something I am not proud of but would do again. I wrote a short, polite email to Kelsey asking for the name of the senior facility she had toured and the contact person, saying I wanted to call and ask about the floor plan of the unit. She replied within an hour with a name, a brochure PDF, and a line that said she was proud of me for being open. I saved the brochure and forwarded nothing to no one. Just after lunch, my doorbell rang. It was the young agent's assistant with the ponytail, her cheeks pink from the kind of adrenaline that comes when you decide on a small rebellion. She said she had 10 minutes before a showing across town. She put a folded piece of paper on my table and told me not to tell anyone who gave it to me. It was a photocopy of the signature page from the listing agreement and the notary's commission number. At the bottom, in pencil, she had written, "There's also a second listing agreement, different brokerage name, same photo set, unpublished yet." Found it in the file previews. I looked up at her and saw not a girl breaking rules, but a person who had recognized the shape of a wrong thing and was trying to push against it with the exact strength she had. When she left, I sat at my table and felt the old part of me, the part that kept a school's petty cash without losing a dime, stand up inside the frightened part. I made a list of calls and names and rules on a yellow pad because pencils are my kind of courage. I thought of Mrs. Holt's signature and the scanner streak and Daniel's check to Tyler. I thought of the lien and the SUV and my husband's note about TD. The house was quiet in the way a stage is just before the curtain rises. And then, while I was labeling the first divider in the binder property title, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't know and a text that said, "Ms. Campos, my name is Maritza. I work in internal controls at your credit union. Please call me back about a discrepancy on a third-party check presented last Friday. This is not a sales call." Maritza's voice over the phone was careful, the way people speak when they are about to ask you to slow down and look at a small detail that changes the whole picture. She said there had been a third-party check deposited at a different bank that morning, a paper check originally issued to me from a utility escrow refund 3 months ago, tiny amount, $86 and some cents, that someone had endorsed over to Coates Notary Services with my name signed above. She said the other bank had pinged our credit union through an image exchange because the endorsement didn't match prior specimens. She asked whether I had given anyone permission to endorse checks on my behalf. I told her no. She asked whether anyone else had access to my mailbox. I said the mailbox was locked, but the key had been missing for a day last week, and I had assumed I'd misplaced it because assuming your own clumsiness is the first tax you pay when you are trying not to be trouble. She asked whether I had noticed any change of address confirmations lately, and I told her I had found one yesterday tucked into the pizza coupons, a form letter saying my online statements would also be mailed to a new document address for redundancy. She asked me to read the address slowly. It was Kelsey's office, not their home. I drove to the branch in the rain because details feel manageable when you carry them in a folder. Maritza met me at a back desk, no glass, Just a small potted plant and a screen with a spreadsheet open. She was younger than I expected, with tired eyes and a badge that said Internal Controls Analyst, as if a person can be distilled into a job title that never sleeps. She walked me through a timeline. Password reset request Thursday from an IP that traced to a shared corporate block. Failed attempts at changing my two-factor authentication because it still pointed to my landline. An attempt to add a trusted device that had been blocked because it tried to use a prepaid number, and then yesterday a new address added for paper statements that a clerk had allowed because the caller knew my mother's maiden name. I told her that piece of trivia hangs in too many places anyway, inside old school files and church rosters and genealogy sites, like we were all taught to build passwords out of postcards. She shook her head and said she would put a human lock on my profile, no changes without in-person verification, and a branch manager's signature, no matter how convincing the caller. She printed a form called Affidavit of Forgery/Unauthorized Endorsement and slid it over. I read it twice because words like affidavit require your best attention. Then I signed, my hand steady because the thing that had seemed vague now had a paper name. When I got home, the neighborhood had already decided a version of my life. Two women I see at the pharmacy were across the street with umbrellas, talking under them like a tent, glancing toward my house between sentences. A week ago, they had asked about the soup night menu, and I had told them about lentils in a way that made them interested. Today, they gave those small smiles people use when they want to be kind without volunteering an opinion. The HOA president, a man who believes Weed Heights threaten property values more than anything else in this world, stopped his dog walk and told me he'd seen the listing and hoped the transition would be smooth. I asked him what transition he was referring to. He said he had heard from one of the board that my son had asked about the process for an expedited lock change for a vacant property. He spoke slowly, as if each word were a piece of furniture he was staging. I told him I was not vacant. He looked at me for a beat and then said, "It's always easier when families are aligned," and I watched the dog tug him away because dogs have better timing than most people. In the afternoon, a white van pulled up with a logo for Tyler's Mobile Notary and Loan Signing. The driver stayed in the van on his phone for a minute, then came to my door holding a clipboard and a tote bag with stamps and a small camera for ID snapshots. He had the friendly, transactional tone of someone who moves through 60 kitchens a month. He said, "Ms. Campos, I'm here for the POA acknowledgement and a new deed package," like he was confirming a sandwich order. I told him to hold on. I got my phone and tapped record because sometimes the only way to remember how things were said is to borrow the memory of a device. He said, "Your son said you're expecting me. We've got a quick claim to place you into a living trust for tax efficiency. You'll like it, and I'll notarize all signatures," and he lifted the tote as if the weight of the stamps proved he knew what he was doing. I asked who prepared the documents. He glanced at the clipboard and said a paralegal at a document service had pulled them using templates. He said, "It's all standard," and when he said standard, I felt the small click inside. That means a door has been nudged without permission. I told him the appointment was canceled, that no documents would be signed on my porch, and that I would not consent to photographs of my ID. He said, "Your son has authority," and I said, "If you believe that, you can present a copy of the authority to the police when they arrive," because I had dialed while we were talking. He went very still for a moment, then said, "No harm," backed away, and left in a way that told me he knows where the lines are but sometimes hopes other people don't. Kelsey arrived an hour later with a grocery bag that contained a new smartphone still in the plastic. She set it on my table and spoke with the bright voice that makes bad news sound like a product launch. She said, "We got you something easier, bigger buttons, good for safety, we'll transfer your number," and she moved toward the landline base, as if my house were a display model. I said no thank you. She said, "At least let me put in our numbers and the doctor's office. This is about peace of mind," and she held the box out like a gift in a commercial. I asked her to tell me the exact reason she had changed my document mailing address to her office. Her eyes flicked the way people's do when two plans in their head bump into each other. She said, "We were trying to keep track of things for you. You know how paper gets lost," and then she added, "It's not that serious," because she heard her own answer and knew it sounded like permission she had given herself. I told her I had reversed the change and placed a fraud alert, and I asked her not to call the bank pretending to be me again. She flushed, put the phone box back into the grocery bag, and started crying the way some people do when they are angry. She said, "We're trying to help. You left the kettle on, you got disoriented at church, and the last time I came over the upstairs sink was dripping," and she loaded the word last with a history she wanted me to accept as proof. I told her she could keep the phone. That night, I posted a note on the inside of my front door with a piece of blue painter's tape that said, "No entry without owner present, no showings authorized." It looked homemade because it was as homemade as the bread I used to take to parent-teacher conferences, and I thought if the agents came they would have to rip off a note that had my measured handwriting on it, and that small act would tell me who they were. I slept badly because my brain was sifting through names and dates and the kind of fear that is mostly logistics. Will I be able to pay the property tax if the account is frozen? Will they take something while I am at the dentist? Would it be outrageous to sit up all night behind the front window with a pen and a clipboard like a guard who weighs 89 pounds? In the morning, a man in work boots knocked. He said he was from the plumbing company and he was here to do the work for the lien. He had a work order that described a repair I had not authorized, with a signature line that showed my name in a version of my name that looked drawn instead of written. He told me he didn't care who paid him as long as someone did, and that either I let him in or his boss would instruct the company to keep the lien in place, because that's what protects them if the house sells. I told him no work would be done until I saw a contract with my real signature, and he shrugged and took a picture of my door number like he was required to prove he'd tried. He said, "I'll mark it as access denied," then asked me if I knew a Daniel and a Kelsey because they seemed competent when they called. He walked down the steps, and I closed the door gently because slamming doors uses up a day's worth of energy and buys nothing. I called a legal aid clinic and waited on hold long enough to learn the recorded menu options by heart. When I finally reached a staff attorney, I explained the POA, the listing, the fake lien, and the notary that seemed to hover over all of it. She listened without interrupting, then told me 4 useful things. First, a durable power of attorney is only valid if I actually signed it and had capacity at the time, and even then it does not give an agent the right to override my explicit refusal to sell my home. Second, any lien must be validly contracted for actual work or materials. If not, I can demand a release, and if they refuse, I can bond it off or sue to quiet title. Third, any change to beneficiary designations while a POA is in effect raises flags. Financial institutions treat those with caution because elder abuse cases often involve beneficiary flips. Fourth, I should file an elder financial exploitation report with Adult Protective Services because even if they do nothing, the existence of a report becomes a timestamp that matters later. She told me to gather originals, to keep a paper trail, and to avoid being alone with anyone who would pressure me to sign. She couldn't represent me because of their intake limits, but she gave me the name of a notary fraud investigator at the Secretary of State's office and the number for a low-cost title attorney who, she said, has an office above a bakery and doesn't make old ladies feel like they should whisper. At church, people who usually ask me about recipes asked instead whether I was excited for the community at the senior residence Kelsey had posted about on her social media. I smiled in a way that made my cheeks hurt and ladled soup carefully because if you spill hot liquid while people are watching, they turn it into a reason. The pastor's wife hugged me and said, "Transitions are hard," but her voice was warm, not performative, and I told her quietly that no transition had been agreed to and that, if she didn't mind, I needed her to note the date and time Kelsey posted anything about me moving because one day words on a screen become evidence even if they were meant to be applause. She nodded, surprised and then focused, and said she would print screenshots because phones disappear and paper keeps its own hours. In the middle of the week, Daniel showed up with 2 large plastic bins and a tape gun. He said he was going to help me declutter because the stager had a list, and if we got ahead of it, the sale price would be stronger, and "This is for you." He said it as if I hadn't been living in the house he was trying to value. He started with the bookshelf in the hall, where my husband's binders of lesson plans sat in a row, and he reached for them with the confidence of someone who believes paper takes up space that should be air. I told him to stop. He said, "Mom, we have to be realistic," and his voice took on the tone he uses with clients who miss their own deadlines. I asked him whether he had instructed the HOA about lock changes for a vacant property. He paused for half a second too long and then said, "We were just asking about timing," and I felt something in my chest go very quiet. I told him to put the tape gun down. He did, and he looked tired because he is tired. He works long hours and has 2 kids who need him and a wife who is competent in ways that make a house a machine. He rubbed his face and said, "You raised me to be responsible. I'm trying to be responsible for you." And I told him responsibility looks different when it is shaped around another person's rights. I received a letter the next day from the senior residence Kelsey had named. The letter thanked me for my deposit and welcomed me to my anticipated new home, unit number listed with a view of the inner garden. It said my move-in date had been tentatively reserved pending completion of a physician's assessment and a capacity form, and that my deposit would be fully refundable if I decided against moving within 3 days. The deposit amount was $5,000. I had not written a check for any deposit. The bank referenced on the receipt was my credit union, drawn as a cashier's check. I drove to Maritza again. She pulled the check image and showed me a cashier's check issued from my account 2 days earlier when someone presented my driver's license details at a different branch and a signed withdrawal slip. The signature looked close to mine in the way I used to copy my mother's when I was 10 to sign reading logs. Practice makes an imitation better, but never good. The teller had called a number listed as mine to confirm, and a woman answered and said yes in a voice that matched the date of birth and the street name. Maritza placed a hold on any further cashier's checks and flagged my ID number with a note requiring in-person manager-level approval and 2 staff signatures for releases. She told me to file a police report because banks count reports more than they count feelings. On Friday, I found a bright envelope in my mailbox with important occupancy notice printed on it. Inside was a letter from the listing brokerage stating that an inspection was scheduled for Tuesday at 10, that I should not be present because inspectors work better without homeowners, and that my belongings would be inventoried for the buyer's insurance because a rent back had been discussed for a week after close. I called the team lead and asked her how she could schedule an inspection for a house that had not been sold by an owner who had not signed a listing. She said the inspection was pre-listing to help calibrate price and that I would be provided a copy of the report if a contract was presented. I told her no one would be entering my home and any attempt would be treated as trespass. She sighed in a way that said I had become that client she complains about in small circles and said, "Your son will handle it," then hung up before I could tell her that sentences like that are exactly how lawsuits get started. I kept 2 sets of notes then, a tidy ledger in a binder and a small notebook in my pocket where I wrote down overheard sentences and dates, because memory is a slippery colleague when you are frightened. In the grocery store line, a woman behind me asked whether I was the lady whose kids were finally convincing her to stop being stubborn. And I thanked her for the unsolicited opinion because my mother taught me to say thank you when people hand you something you didn't ask for. The pharmacist asked whether I wanted my prescriptions transferred closer to the senior residence when I moved, and I asked him to annotate my file with the note, "No transfers without written request by me." He laughed, then saw my face, then typed in the note quietly, and his seriousness gave me back a small piece of breath. On Saturday morning, a certified letter arrived from a law office I did not recognize. It was a notice of intent to seek temporary conservatorship, filed by Daniel as petitioner, with a hearing date 3 Fridays from now and a physician's declaration form attached that was blank except for the header. The petition cited concern about my executive functioning, examples listed as a left-on kettle and a missed appointment that had not been missed, but rescheduled. It also cited a risk of financial waste because I refused to sell a property at peak market value. It asked for temporary control over my person and estate so he could arrange proper care. It asked for ex parte relief in the interim to prevent me from dissipating assets. It was the kind of document that takes the air out of a kitchen. I sat down and read it again. Then I called the low-cost title attorney above the bakery, even though this wasn't title, because sometimes the person who understands one corner of your problem knows the name of the person who handles the other corners. He picked up on the third ring, his voice rough with afternoon coffee. I explained fast and then slower. He told me I needed a conservatorship defense lawyer, not him, but that in the meantime I should document every independent task I completed, gather letters from people who see me functioning, and get a capacity evaluation from a geriatrician of my choosing before anyone else tried to shepherd me into a kindly trap. He said, do not sign anything, do not let anyone set your appointments, and get a mailbox at a private mail center to step around whatever your son thinks he has done with addresses, because addresses are levers. He also told me to call the Secretary of State's Notary Division about Tyler Coates and to file a complaint with the county recorder about the lien, because recorded complaints become part of the file that title companies read. He gave me the number of a woman named Asha who handles elder abuse cases with a precision that makes judges pay attention. He said her retainer was not cheap, but that she believed in payment plans more than she believed in money. By Sunday, word had spread that I was being difficult. A cousin on Daniel's side sent a message that said, "Family needs you to cooperate, this isn't about you," and I laughed alone because that sentence stands on a hill built of contradictions. The church's youth director, who has known me since I stood behind tables with paper plates and a bucket of potato salad, stopped me in the hall and said her husband is a police officer, off duty today, and did I want him to do a walkthrough in case I felt unsafe. I told her yes, and he came by, walked the perimeter, and suggested I install a camera pointed at the driveway and another inside the entry hall, because people behave differently when their behavior has a witness that isn't exhausted. He also told me to call dispatch if anyone arrived claiming authority under a document and to ask the officer to examine the ID and the document carefully and to make a report number. He didn't seem interested in the family drama. He seemed interested in whether a citizen in a small house would be bullied by paperwork. On Monday morning, before I could call Asha, a social worker from Adult Protective Services arrived with a clipboard and a smile that carried no judgment. She said they had received a report of possible self-neglect and that her visit was unannounced by design so she could see how I lived. I invited her in. She looked at my kitchen, noted the labels on the spice jars, checked the dates on perishables in the fridge, looked at the medicines in the bathroom, tested the smoke alarm, and asked me to show her my bill-paying system. I showed her the ledger and the stack of envelopes with stamps, and I explained the online safeguards I had set up with Maritza. She nodded slowly, asked me about the kettle, asked if I had people I could call for help who didn't have an interest in my house, and then, with no rush at all, she said, if someone is using safety to move you off your property, that is not safety. That is an outcome with a marketing plan, her words, not mine, and she handed me a brochure about restraining orders for elder abuse, civil not criminal, that can include orders against financial control. She asked if I wanted her to note in her file that I seemed organized and oriented and in control of my affairs. I told her I did. She typed it in front of me and then said, "I'll file my report by end of day," and I believed her because she looked like a person who makes lists and finishes them. In the afternoon, I received a text from the agent's assistant with the ponytail that said, "Check the MLS right now," and when I did, I saw a second listing for my address at a lowered price with a different brokerage name. Active but with no photos and a note that said seller motivated, representative authorized for quick close. The representative's name was an LLC controlled by a trust one had never heard of, and the registered agent was a private mailbox store in a strip mall I know because I buy stamps there when the post office line is long. I called the number and a man answered and said, "You must be the occupant." And I told him that if he published a listing for my property again, I would file a complaint with the real estate board and sue for slander of title, because words can degrade property value the way graffiti can if they are published in the right place. He hung up. The listing disappeared an hour later, as if a hand had snatched a note off a bulletin board when the teacher walked in. That evening Daniel came by without Kelsey, the weariness on his face no longer mixed with confidence. He sat without being asked, looked at his hands for a long moment, and said, "This got out of control." The thing with the notary, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I thought we were doing this at the right pace. He told me the deposit for the senior residence had come from a cashier's check Kelsey picked up because she said the market would dip and we had to move. And he had agreed because Kelsey is persuasive and because he felt squeezed between the costs of his own life and the fantasy of order the listing agent had sold them. He said, "We thought you'd resist and then be relieved," and I asked him if he hurt himself. He said, "Please don't get a lawyer. We can fix this together," and I told him I had already called one and that I would rather have us fix this together with witnesses than together in a kitchen where someone thinks their love entitles them to my signature. Before bed, I checked the camera feed the youth director's husband had installed. At 2 a.m, the beam of a flashlight moved across my driveway, stopped at the mailbox, and then my camera caught the back of a head under a hoodie as someone tried to open the box and found it locked. The figure stood for a moment like a person who can't decide whether to escalate, then left. I wrote the time down. At 8, a courier knocked and handed me a thick envelope from the title company the listing agent uses. Inside was a request for owner cooperation, asking me to fill out a seller's disclosure packet and provide HOA dues records and copies of permits for past work, with a sticky note that said, "Please return within 48 hours to stay on schedule." I laughed without joy and set the packet on the table like a piece of junk mail that had learned to swagger. At noon, while I was on the phone with Asha's office leaving a message, a knock sounded that had the weight of officialdom. I opened the door to find a process server holding a stack of papers and a bright pink copy on top. He handed them to me and said, "You've been served," and the words were sharp but ordinary. The packet contained an ex parte application filed that morning by Daniel's attorney seeking a temporary order, allowing him to enter my house to inventory and secure personal property necessary for sale, and to arrange for move of occupant to contracted care pending hearing. The judge had not signed yet. There was a hearing set for the next morning at 9. Attached as an exhibit was a letter authorizing a moving company to arrive at 7 and begin packing. On the letter, under Daniel's signature, the title read "Attorney in fact for Teresa Campos," as if my name now came with a footnote that tried to erase me. Outside, as if on cue, a box truck rolled slow down the street and idled by the curb, the driver looking at my house number, his helper tapping the side of the truck with a ring. The appointment time on the work order was circled. The name of the sender was the brokerage's staging department. The men stepped out and walked toward my gate. I opened the door enough to block the frame with my shoulder and spoke through the gap because I was not going to be bullied into giving anybody the stage. The two movers in company t-shirts shifted their weight when they saw the camera above the door blinking red. I held up the ex parte application packet and said, "This is a request, not an order. The judge hasn't signed anything. You are not authorized to touch a single spoon in this house." And then, without raising my voice, I added, "A patrol car is on its way, and you will be in the report if you cross the property line." The taller one looked at the shorter one with that look workers give each other when their day just got more complicated, and he said, "We'll tag it as access denied and bill the sender," and they backed down the steps, muttering about paperwork that always ends up in their lap. The truck idled another minute and then rolled away, leaving the curb as quiet as it had been an hour earlier when I still believed ordinary rules would protect me. I called dispatch, gave the operator the process server's name and the case number, and asked for an officer to document an attempted unlawful entry based on an unsigned order. When the officer arrived, I had the packet, the camera footage queued up, and a copy of my driver's license ready so the report would have no gaps. He watched the clip of the movers on my phone, took down the details, and said, "If they return tonight, call us again and reference this number. We'll tag your address for priority response." Before he left, he looked at the sticker I had posted on the door and said, "Keep it there, it helps." I recorded his name, the time, and the report number in my binder, each digit like a small nail holding the day in place. Asha called back at 7, voice low and quick, and said, "You will meet me at the courthouse at 8:30, courtroom 6. I will be filing an opposition and a request for a temporary restraining order to prevent interference with your person and property. Bring everything, especially the bank affidavit and the lien printout." I told her about the listing agent's second unpublished file and the scanner streak. She said, "Good, chain of anomalies. Judges notice patterns when they are stacked." She asked me 2 questions that landed like anchors in water. Did I want a capacity evaluation by a neutral geriatrician I chose, and was I willing to be brutally boring in court so the judge would see me as a person who pays attention, not a spectacle? I said yes to both, and she laughed softly like someone who appreciates clean answers when the room is on fire. I used the next hours the way I used to use late nights at the school before audits, exactly, without melodrama. I printed out the credit union's login log showing the shared corporate IP, highlighted the posted in-branch confirmation only note from years ago, and clipped it to Maritz's affidavit. I wrote a short summary of events on a single page in 12-point font with dates on the left, verbs in the middle, and documents on the right so that a judge could see at a glance that this was not a story, this was a sequence. I called the senior residence and asked the administrator to email me a letter stating who presented the cashier's check and what ID they used for the deposit. 15 minutes later, I had a PDF on my screen saying the payer had been Kay Underwood, which is Kelsey's maiden name and also the name she uses at work. I forwarded it to Asha with the subject line, "Deposit Source." At 10, the young assistant from the brokerage called from a blocked number and, with breath that sounded like she had been running, told me she had seen an internal message about syncing my listing to a second brokerage in case seller resistance delayed the timeline. She said, "They keep a whiteboard where they mark certain clients red if family is involved. Your address was red from day one. I think they thought your son would take the heat." But then she went quiet, and I heard someone near her ask whether she had locked a file room. I told her she had done enough for me, that I would never say her name, and that I would remember that she had chosen decency in a room that rewarded speed. After we hung up, I printed my phone records from the last week so the blocked call would have a timestamp, and yes, I even wrote down the scent of the candle they had used at the open house, because one day some detail like that might jog a memory. I slept in clothes I could wear to court because I know my own nerves, woke before dawn, set coffee to drip, and put my documents into a zippered portfolio that has belonged to me since before my son was born. On the top I placed an index card where I had written the 3 sentences I would repeat if I needed to. I do not consent to the sale of my home. I did not sign the power of attorney. I am here voluntarily and I am oriented to date, time, and place. I locked my door, checked the camera feed, and walked to my car without looking back because sometimes eye contact with a house makes leaving it harder. The courthouse had the worn shine of a building that has processed too many people and not enough repair budgets, and Asha was exactly as I hoped, a woman whose suit fit because she picks people who hem carefully, whose bag contained highlighters, tabs, and a pad already labeled with the case caption. She asked me questions quickly and kindly, medication list, emergency contacts, a brief history of my finances, why my husband and I updated our will when we did, how long I had been teaching children to keep clean ledgers. When she finished, she touched my wrist lightly and said, "You are going to answer only what is asked, no speeches. If they say you are confused, you will ask them to repeat the question. If they push, I will object. And if the judge asks whether you consent to your son managing your life, you will look him in the eye and say no." I nodded and, for the first time since the open house, felt like I was not a person others were moving across a board, but someone who could put a piece down and have it stay where I said it. We filed the opposition and the TRO request with Exhibits A through K, the bank affidavit and login log, the senior residence deposit letter, my photos of the listing packet with the scanner streak, the mobile notary's business registration showing he is Kelsey's brother's partner in a loan signing service, the contractor lien with the matching notary seal and the mortgage company address, the HOA message about lock change inquiries, and the Adult Protective Services preliminary note that I appeared oriented and in control of my affairs. When the clerk stamped the copies, Asha smiled tightly the way craftsmen do when a measurement they guessed comes out exact. She whispered, "This judge likes documents more than speeches. We just fed him a buffet." Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man whose tie knot looked expensive and whose hair did that thing people's hair does when they believe everything will go their way, because it often has. Daniel didn't look at me at first. When he did, I saw my boy and I saw a man who was afraid of being told he had done something irrevocable. He said, "Mom," and then stopped because there was not a sentence in the world that could make the next hour gentler. Kelsey wasn't with him. I noticed that and wrote it down in my head like I write down weather on planting days. Inside the courtroom, the judge took the bench with the kind of absent-minded precision that tells you he has done this for decades. Daniel's attorney began with concern, painting me as a beloved mother who had shown signs of decline, citing the kettle, the wandering at church that was actually me refilling bowls, and the financial risk of refusing to sell at peak value. Asha let him speak long enough to demonstrate that his case relied on adjectives. Then she stood, slid our stack across the counsel table, and said, "Your Honor, this is not a care plan. This is a paper raid, and the record shows attempts to seize control of my client's assets through forged endorsements, unauthorized address changes, and an invalid notarial chain." She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. She pointed to exhibits, named dates, and often ended a sentence with a verb instead of a flourish. The judge turned to me and asked me my name, my address, today's date, and the time. I answered without hurrying. He asked me to describe how my bills are paid. I told him I pay them myself, with a ledger I brought if he wanted to see it. He asked whether I consented to my son becoming temporary conservator. I said, "No, Your Honor, I do not," and I looked at Daniel because I will not conduct my life in a way that avoids my own child's eyes. The judge nodded, flipped through our exhibits, paused at the senior residence deposit letter, and then at the notary business record. He asked Daniel's attorney about Tyler Coates' relationship to Kelsey's family. The attorney said he didn't know. Asha handed up a printout from the Secretary of State's Notary Division showing the commission number, the business registration, and the shared mailing address with Kelsey's Brothers LLC. The judge exhaled, not theatrically, but the way a person exhales when a lump in the batter turns out to be a cockroach. He denied the ex parte request to enter my home and pack my belongings. He set the conservatorship petition for a full hearing in 6 weeks and ordered a neutral capacity evaluation by a geriatrician selected from the court's panel to be scheduled by me, not by the petitioner. He granted our temporary restraining order prohibiting interference with my person and property, banning any showings or listings without my written consent, and ordering the withdrawal of the contractor lien pending a hearing on its validity. He signed narrowly, the way careful judges do, not telling me I was right about everything, but telling me I would not be treated like luggage while men measured and nodded. Daniel's attorney asked for limited access to inventory heirlooms, and the judge said no access without Ms. Campos present and consenting, and no inventorying what you do not own. He looked at me and said, "Ma'am, keep your paperwork neat, be at your evaluation on time, and stay off social media," and I nodded as if I had been given a houseplant to water. Outside the courtroom, Daniel walked toward me with his hands out slightly in that primitive appeal gesture men use when they want a scene to soften. He said, "Mom, we were trying to help," and I said, "You paid a notary to pretend I agreed to the sale of my home, you sent movers to my door with an unsigned order, and you used my name on a cashier's check to pay a deposit for a place I did not choose. Help looks different than that." He swallowed, stared at the floor, and said, "Kelsey handled most of that, and the way he said her name made me understand more than he intended." I told him he could come by Saturday morning for coffee without his wife, and we would talk about boundaries, not property. He nodded once, uncertain, and left with his attorney, who had stopped smiling. The day's protection orders gave me breathing room, but protection without a plan is just a pause, and a pause is when careless people regroup. Asha and I walked to her office and closed the door. She said, "Now we build the public moment. We will send preservation letters to the brokerages demanding they retain all communications and drafts about your property. We will subpoena the whiteboard photo if our insider can obtain it. We will bring the notary's entire journal into court. And we will prepare a petition to expunge the lien, serve the contractor, and request sanctions for slander of title." I told her about the HOA president and his comment about lock changes. She said, "Good, we'll subpoena the email thread." I told her about the church posts. She said, "Screenshots, date stamped, with URLs." She wrote tasks in block letters on a yellow pad and tore off the sheet for me like a prescription written in actions. Maritza called as I was leaving Asha's office and said a man had tried to add a trusted device again at the credit union, a request denied and logged, and that she had flagged the pattern for their risk team. She said, also, the cashier's check camera caught a clear image of the presenter's nails and ring, and your description of Kelsey matches the jewelry in her public photos. I cannot say that in a formal letter without privacy approvals, but I can say the teller is available to testify if subpoenaed. I thanked her and told her I would drop off a tin of cookies after this was done, not because gratitude is transactional, but because people who guard ledgers deserve to be reminded that their choices nourish more than balances. At home, I changed the locks with the youth director's husband supervising and installed a second camera inside the entry facing the hallway table where I keep the small silver bowl for keys. I called the court-approved geriatrician and booked an evaluation for the following Tuesday at 9. When the scheduler asked whether I needed a ride, I said, no, thank you, I'll drive myself, and when I hung up I realized how much weight such a small sentence can hold in a file. I faxed the appointment confirmation to Asha because the world is kinder to women who can prove they showed up on time. That evening the agent's assistant sent an email from a personal account with a single line. Look at DocuSign envelope ID 3A7F. In the audit trail, time zones don't match. I opened the PDF of the listing agreement she had photographed, clicked the certificate of completion data, and saw it. My electronic signature was supposedly completed at 6:47 p.m. from an IP in another state, while I was on the church live stream serving soup with a visible timestamp. I printed the audit certificate, circled the time zone mismatch, and taped it to a fresh exhibit tab. False benefactor was no longer a suspicion. It was a row of numbers that didn't know how to lie. By 9 I was unpacking groceries when a text arrived from an unknown number. You should have taken the easy way. We're not done. I took a screenshot, forwarded it to Asha, and then to the officer who had made the earlier report. He called back and said, save it, don't respond, send me your phone carrier details, we'll add it. I nodded even though he couldn't see me and placed the screenshot into the binder, realizing my binder had begun to feel like a person I could trust. When I finally sat down, the house was quiet in the way I had always loved, with the clock near the piano clicking just loud enough to mark time without intruding. I allowed myself a minute to miss my husband, then turned to the folder that held our deed, the original will, and the note about TD designations we never finished. I planned to photograph each document for off-site backup and place the originals in a safe deposit box first thing in the morning. I opened the folder, laid out the deed, the will, the insurance rider, and reached for the sticky note with my husband's writing to tuck it back into the plastic sleeve. The sticky note was gone. On the bottom of the folder lay a thin square of paper the exact size of a sticky, same faint yellow, but blank, as if someone had peeled our little unfinished instruction off its history. I checked the floor, the table, the inside of the plastic, the pocket, the chair, the carpet under my feet. I closed the folder, opened it again, and stared at the empty space where his hand had once told me what to do next. I looked at the entry camera feed and rewound to the afternoon when I had left for court. At 8:12 a.m., 2 minutes after I locked the door, the young man who canvasses for a telecom company approached my porch, tugged at the handle as if to leave a flyer, and then walked away. At 11:03 a.m., the neighbor's cat triggered the motion sensor. At 2:17 p.m., a shadow passed the sidelights that was not a person, not a cat, not a branch. It was like the edge of a coat, except there had been no knock, no door opening, no visible movement of the handle, and then the camera glitched for a single second and resumed without a missing frame. I sat very still and listened to the house breathe, then to the phone buzzing on the table. It was Asha, her message short. We just received a file share from an anonymous Proton mail, video of a notary journal page with your name and a note that says commission expired, backdated. There's also a text thread between Kelsey and Tyler. The sender wants to meet in public tomorrow and says, bring the binder so I can show you what's missing. The church hall had been prepared for Lucas's school fundraiser, but Sophia had turned it into her stage. She had gathered her parents, several of James's business partners, and even a notary she claimed would finalize adjustments to the estate. I sat quietly near the back, my grandson's hand in mine, watching her glide across the room in a fitted black dress that seemed more suited for a cocktail party than a school event. Every movement was designed to project confidence, control, ownership. But I had learned to recognize performance, and that evening her act was about to collapse. Thomas Bennett, James's longtime friend and attorney, arrived with a leather folder under his arm. Sophia greeted him warmly, almost too warmly, her hand lingering on his sleeve as she guided him to the front table. "We'll keep this brief," she announced, addressing the room. James wanted everything handled efficiently. For Lucas's sake, of course. Her voice trembled just enough to mimic grief, but her eyes sparkled with anticipation. Thomas cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, I want to remind everyone that James's wishes were very specific. His will was updated less than a year ago, and he left clear instructions about the distribution of his assets and guardianship arrangements." Sophia interrupted him, a little too quickly. Yes, but surely we can simplify matters. As James's widow, I'll manage the estate. It's what he would have wanted." She turned toward me, her smile sharp. "Isn't that right, Margaret?" I met her gaze steadily. "I think we should let Thomas read James's words. He spent months preparing them with my son. Let's honor that work." The room grew quiet. A few of James's colleagues shifted uncomfortably, sensing tension beneath the politeness. Thomas opened the folder and began reading. "To my beloved son Lucas, I leave the trust fund established in his name, accessible upon his 18th birthday. Until that time, guardianship is to be shared equally between his grandmother, Margaret Reynolds, and his mother, Sophia Reynolds." Murmurs rippled through the room. Sophia's painted smile stiffened. "Shared equally," she repeated, her voice a shade higher. "That can't be right." James knew I was fully capable of raising Lucas on my own. Thomas continued as if she hadn't spoken. "As for the management of financial assets, including investments and property, I appoint Thomas Bennett as trustee, with oversight granted to Margaret Reynolds. No major decisions are to be made without both of their written consent." Sophia's composure cracked. "This is absurd. James trusted me. He told me so. I've been handling everything since she faltered, realizing her words could be challenged. It was then that Thomas withdrew a second document. James anticipated this might be contested. He prepared a letter, handwritten, which I was instructed to read aloud in this very situation. He unfolded the paper slowly, giving everyone time to witness the authenticity of James's script. My heart pounded as Thomas began. "My dear family, if you're hearing this, it means I am gone sooner than expected. I want to be clear. I loved Sophia as my wife, but over time I became deeply concerned about her financial decisions and her neglect of Lucas's well-being. I could not ignore those concerns, so I arranged safeguards. Margaret, you have always been Lucas's anchor. I trust you to protect him. Sophia, I hope this will push you to reflect and change, but I could not risk leaving everything in your hands." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sophia's face drained of color. Her lips parted as if she might object, but no sound came out. The notary looked at her with professional detachment, confirming the document's validity with a nod. And then, as if fate wanted to end her performance once and for all, Mrs. Caldwell, the neighbor who had often babysat Lucas, stepped forward. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything," she began, her voice trembling, but I saw Sophia meeting with Mr. Harlow several times at the Marriott downtown, even before James passed. They weren't business meetings. "I'm sorry, but everyone deserves to know." A shocked murmur spread through the guests. Sophia turned on her with sudden ferocity. "That's a lie. How dare you?" But her voice cracked, and in that moment, the image she had built so carefully crumbled. People who had been nodding politely before now looked at her with suspicion, even disgust. Lucas pressed closer to me, whispering, "Grandma, is it true?" I squeezed his hand. "What matters is your father made sure you'll be safe." Thomas closed the folder firmly. These are James's wishes. They are legally binding. There is no room for negotiation. Sophia's jaw tightened, her eyes darting around the room in search of allies. But even her own parents avoided her gaze. The weight of the truth of James's foresight and her own exposed duplicity hung heavy in the air. For the first time, she seemed small, cornered, stripped of the control she had flaunted. I looked at her one last time, not with hatred but with the quiet strength that had carried me through these months. James knew who you really were, Sophia. And now, so does everyone else. The silence that followed was colder than any words. 6 weeks later, I took the same elevator to the same courthouse with a different kind of weight in my bag. Not fear this time, but the measured heft of exhibits that had been tested and found sound. Asha had lined up the witnesses in an order that made sense to a person who has never lived in my house, and when the clerk called our case, the rows behind us filled with people who had played small roles in a story none of them had asked to join. The court-appointed geriatrician sat near the aisle with a neat stack of notes. Maritza from the credit union held a folder stamped with her department's watermark. The social worker from Adult Protective Services had her tablet open to the visit report, and the brokerage's young assistant, hair pinned back and hands still, stared at the table as if looking directly at us might make her change her mind. Daniel had come with a different attorney and without Kelsey, which told me more than any statement he could prepare. Asha went first with the calm of a person who knows that the right order of events is its own kind of persuasion. She walked the judge from the attempted listing to the lien to the cashier's check for the senior residence deposit, then through the DocuSign certificate with time zones that did not match my body pouring soup at church on a visible live stream. And finally to the notary's journal page we had received through the anonymous file share, the one with my name written next to a stamp that had expired 3 weeks before the date on the power of attorney. When she asked permission to publish the text thread between Kelsey and the notary, just 2 messages, not a log designed to inflame, but enough, the judge allowed it. There on the screen were words no one in that room could unsee. Backdate it to match the file. She'll be moved by then, and use mom's friend as witness, poor eyesight. Asha did not look at me when the messages appeared. She looked at the bench, because this was not about my feelings, it was about a record. The geriatrician testified next that I had arrived early to the evaluation, that I brought a medication list printed and annotated, that I had scored well above the cutoff on the cognitive tests, and that my functional assessment showed I was managing my finances and daily life without impairment. He used the exact phrases the court favors and nothing extra, which is how you talk when your work must stand in rooms like this one. Maritza took the stand and explained the address change attempts, the blocked device edition, and the cashier's check with the presenter who matched the jewelry in the senior residence camera still. She did not say Kelsey's name because she respects rules, but she did say the teller could identify the presenter if the court requested. The APS social worker confirmed her unannounced visit and her conclusion that I was organized, oriented, and capable, and that attempts to remove me under the guise of safety were inconsistent with what she observed in my home. The young assistant from the brokerage spoke last for us, voice steady, hands clasped, and said her office had a practice of duplicating files across brokerages for resistant sellers, that my listing certificate had been generated after hours by a staffer using a template from a different state, and that she had seen a whiteboard with my address marked red because family involved fast track. She said she would accept any consequences for speaking here and asked the judge if she could submit a photograph of the whiteboard that she had taken at risk to her job. He admitted it without drama. Daniel did not try to argue with the facts because he could not. His attorney asked him 2 questions about fear and responsibility, and he answered without the phrases people use when they want to be forgiven on a technicality. He said, "My mother taught me to balance a checkbook, and I forgot what that means when you're the one holding someone else's pen." And then he said, "Kelsey told me this was how families handle transitions, and I did not check the steps because I wanted it to be solved." The judge listened with the same attention he gave to everyone else, then closed the file and ruled. He denied the conservatorship petition with prejudice, ordered the immediate withdrawal of any listings or marketing related to my home, referred the notary evidence to the Secretary of State and the district attorney for investigation. enjoined any parties from attempting to change my address or access my accounts without my written authorization, and set a hearing date on my slander of title motion against the contractor and the brokerage's staging arm. He did not raise his voice. He signed orders. He looked at me and said, "Ms. Campos, if anyone attempts to move forward without you, call Chambers," and I nodded, because I know how to follow an instruction that is actually protection. Outside the courtroom, people separated into their correct groupings without being told. Asha asked me to wait while she filed certified copies. The social worker squeezed my hand and said, "If you want a support letter for any disciplinary hearings, I will write it," and then moved away to take a call that probably tells someone else that today is not the day they have to prove they still count. The young assistant stood near the trash can as if indecision had pinned her to that spot, then came toward me and said, "My name is Lila. I should have told you sooner." And I told her she had told me in time because our days are measured by what we do before harm becomes permanent. Daniel approached alone. He did not reach for me because he has begun to learn something about boundaries. He said, "Mom, I have paused the deposit on the senior residence. We will undo the things we did, and I will cooperate with any investigation that asks what I signed or sent." I told him to come by Saturday at 10 with no one else and a notebook, and that we would write down a plan for the next year that includes what I will not be asked to do and what he will not do without calling me first. He nodded and said, "Thank you for not shutting the door," and I said, "You will be on time." What followed was not a montage, because life does not clean itself up in a sequence. It was a calendar that filled with tasks you can name and complete. The notary's commission was suspended pending investigation within 2 weeks, and by month's end the Secretary of State had revoked it altogether, citing backdating and failure to maintain a proper journal. The district attorney filed charges for forgery and identity theft against the notary, and opened a separate investigation into the contractor lien. The contractor released the lien before the hearing once Asha served them with our motion and the threat of sanctions, which she pursued anyway because false filings leave stains that need bleach and deterrence. The real estate board opened a complaint file against the team lead and broker of record for the duplicate listing and for publishing incorrect special remarks. They settled with fines and a public reprimand. And I received a letter from their counsel that used the word regret in a sentence that did not ask me to forgive them. The senior residents returned the deposit before anyone had to be ordered to do it, and their administrator asked for permission to use my case in staff training about third-party checks. I gave permission because it might spare another woman a day like the one I had. At home, I replaced the small silver bowl for keys with a heavier ceramic one, not because I expected keys to start behaving, but because weight on a table is a reminder you can feel. I met with my credit union's estate specialist and set up the TOD designations my husband and I had intended, naming my grandchildren in a way that secures their education without making anyone wait on probate. I reviewed my will with Asha and added a clause that requires any agent under any future power of attorney to account quarterly to a third party of my choosing, and to lose authority upon any attempt to transfer my real property without my written consent. I filed a civil elder abuse restraining order against Kelsey, limited in scope to financial acts, because my safety is not a mood that changes when apologies arrive, and the judge granted it for 3 years, crisp and clear. When Kelsey tried to send a message through a cousin, I forwarded it to my attorney and the police and did not answer. I do not return to rooms where doors were taken off their hinges. On the first Saturday after the hearing, Daniel came at 10 on time with a notebook. He stood in the doorway waiting for me to say, "Come in," which is a sentence that restores something grown threadbare. We sat at the dining table that had been called negotiable and wrote 2 columns. His tasks included parenting his own children without using "grandma will take them" as a default, attending a counseling program offered through his work about caregiver stress and financial ethics, closing the shared drive where Kelsey had stored scans of my mail, and providing me with a list of any automatic payments he had set up in my name so I could move them back or cancel them. Mine included attending the community legal clinic's workshop to teach other seniors how to set fraud flags at their banks, keeping my health appointments, and calling him on the first of every month to say whether I needed anything heavy carried or any ladder work done. We initialed the paper like people who understand that agreements are friendlier when they are also written. 2 months later, the state made an offer on the undeveloped land outside Austin for a right-of-way corridor and a buffer parcel. I negotiated politely and firmly, hired an appraiser recommended by OSHA, and sold the buffer at a fair price while retaining the remaining acreage. I took a portion of the proceeds and established a small scholarship at the community college for adults returning to finish accounting certificates because ledgers saved me more than once. And I know what it is to have competence underestimated until someone needs a total that makes sense. I also replaced the neighborhood church's failing freezer for soup night and ordered a second one because running out of cold space is how good intentions spoil. People asked me whether I forgave Daniel. I told them forgiveness is not a verdict you announce once for a crowd. It is a policy you enforce in writing. He comes for coffee every Saturday at 10. He does not bring forms. He sometimes brings my grandchildren, who now know that I will be at their school plays without anyone scheduling me like a resource. He calls before he drops by and stands in the doorway until I say his name. Kelsey has moved out. I do not know whether they will divorce. I know only that I am not a bystander in the next part of their story, and that none of my boundaries are conditional on optimism. The agent's assistant, Lila, lost her job but gained offers within a month because truth has a way of writing references when you cannot. She works at a title company now. We meet for coffee sometimes, and she tells me about how files look different when you know the people inside them refuse to be handled. Maritza received a commendation from her department and a promotion. I sent flowers because she would never send them to herself. The HOA president still trims his hedges the way he always did. He nods when he sees me on my porch and has not mentioned expedited lock changes since the court orders were entered into the minutes. I keep the binder on a shelf within reach of the table, not because I expect to need it, but because it reminds me that attention is a kind of inheritance. When I hear someone at the pharmacy telling a clerk that their daughter is helping with the paperwork, I turn my head and listen for the shape of that help. Sometimes I speak up and suggest they ask for copies and keep a written log. Sometimes I say nothing because people are allowed their own learning curves. I no longer swallow my worry to be easy for everyone else. I am not difficult now, I am exact. I am telling you this as a friend at my kitchen table, the same one a stranger once labeled negotiable. I still cook for soup night every other Thursday. I still keep the tin of small screws in the drawer because things loosen and need tightening when you least expect it. I still write down the names of people who do what they say they will do because I believe in crediting efforts that hold. When I lock my door at night, I do it with the solid knowledge that it is my door. If that sounds simple, it is because simplicity takes work. In case you are wondering, I did find the missing sticky note. It arrived months later in an envelope with no return address, folded around a brief apology written in a hand that tried to disguise itself. The note said only, "I thought you wouldn't notice." I slipped it into a plastic sleeve behind the will. When people come into my life now, I assume they will notice what matters because I will point to it and say, "This stays with me." I think about the first day they staged my living room and lit a candle to make strangers imagine themselves in my house. The bowl of mints is long gone. In its place is a small card that reads "Owner Present." I didn't buy it from a store that sells decorations for tables. I printed it myself and laminated it at the library. When people step into my doorway now, they read that card before they set down their bags, and then they look at me and say, "Hello, Teresa," and wait for what comes next. I will not tell you that everything is mended, because some fabric does not return to how it was. I will tell you that my home is quiet for the right reasons again, that my name is on every line where it belongs, and that I have built a circle of people who would never use the word vacant next to my address. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Write things down, ask to see the paper they say exists, and make them put their names under their claims. You are not a burden when you insist on your own signature. And to the person who slid that sticky note into an envelope thinking I would not recognize a stolen square returning home, I will say this, not in anger, but in plain language, it took me less time to see your hand than it will take you to clean your conscience. I am busy. I am not available to help you with that. I am at my table with my coffee, planning Thursday's soup and next Saturday's talk with my son at 10. The house is mine, and I am here.